day and night. BBC Persian, VOA Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, Iran International, which is Saudi. So you have more TV channels and websites beaming into Iran from outside than you actually have in the country that deal with politics. So I think it's something really unprecedented in the world. So imagine in the United States, they make an accusation, which they've never proven. They've never proven, and I don't believe there any such evidence exists, that Trump was made president by Putin, that President Putin somehow installed Trump. And you had 4 years of crisis in the United States because of one allegation. But when it comes to Iran, the Americans and the Europeans and their allies, the Saudis, are constantly trying to manipulate Iranian elections. They're trying to wreck the Iranian economy, to undermine support for the state. When you take all this into account, in my humble opinion, that exists in Iran is, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, you can disagree, obviously, is quite an achievement. It is quite significant. We do have real elections. Are they ideal? No. Is Iran an ideal democracy? No. Is Iran a utopia? No. Is Iran full of faults? Definitely. But this particular election is important because the previous administration was liberal in its economic outlook. In general, the reformists and the moderates in Iran are pro-free market, relatively speaking. And I would say that the conservatives are more left-leaning. And this is something that may confuse some of our friends in Europe, because usually conservatives are more, in Western countries are more liberal-leaning with regards to the economy. So let me put it this way: the so-called conservatives or the principalists in Iran, they're more culturally conservative, but they're more economically leftist. This is a general. I'm not saying everyone is like that, but I'm saying in general, the conservatives or the principalists, they're more culturally conservative, but they're more economically left-leaning. Some moderately left-leaning, and of course the word moderate can mean many things, and I don't mean it in a good way or a bad way, but some are less left-leaning and some are more left-leaning. So Mr. Raisi, who is the front runner, and he has been the most popular person in the polls for a relatively long time before the elections, he's become popular because he's been seen as an anti-corruption figure, and also because he is left-leaning, and when the economy goes bad, it benefits the left for many. So, or at least the left grows stronger. So I would consider him to be left-leaning, but not the most radical left among the Iranian political elites. So in my opinion, what will probably happen, the most important change that we'll, in my opinion, be seeing are two things. One is that he will probably be tilting the Iranian state towards the left, and therefore strengthening the social net, the net for the disenfranchised and the impoverished, and more funding will be going to those who are jobless or those who are vulnerable, and probably more pressure will be put on private companies, private individuals, wealthy individuals, with regards to taxation and so on. But taxes will probably decrease with regards to production. In other words, factories. So whether privately owned factories or publicly owned factories, because we have both, we'll probably see a decrease in taxation in order to okay, sorry about that. So we'll probably see a decrease in taxation in order to increase production in the country. But as I said, in general, I think that the wealthy will probably be facing greater taxation, and there are many loopholes in the system with regards to taxes, because Iran, since in the past it was always dependent on its oil revenue, very little taxation existed in the country during the Shah's time, and after the revolution, gradually the system developed, but it's still full of loopholes. So I think he'll be tilting to the left economically. The second important thing is that I think that he will be tilting towards the east as well. In other words, Iran will be more closely associated with the global south, as well as China, Russia, and neighboring countries, and of course Central Asia and so on. And he will be looking less to Europe and the United States and more towards the rest of the world. So the current administration, I would argue, is more center-right when it comes to economics, culturally more liberal, but also economically speaking more liberal, and more leaning towards, and I don't want to exaggerate, and I don't want to, I'm not saying it's a pro-Western government, the current administration, but I think its tendency is to tilt more towards the West in the hope, and their hope is that somehow the nuclear deal can be, the Americans will abide by their commitments, and the nuclear deal will be reactivated, basically, and then that this government was aspiring maybe to have better cooperation with Europe and Western countries. But I think the next government, if Mr. Raisi does win, and all polls indicate that he will win big, because the candidates that are linked to the moderates and the reformists are, because this administration is so unpopular now, they really don't have a chance. But even though they didn't have their ideal candidates, but still they wouldn't have won, because this administration is so unpopular. Of course, and I'm sort of digressing, but its unpopularity is it's not completely its own fault. We had Trump, we had the coronavirus. So this administration has been very unfortunate in many ways, uniquely speaking, it's unique how unfortunate they've been. But in any case, I think that this administration, while more optimistic,
Χάσαμε τον ήχο.
Houston, we have a problem.
Ναι. Άρα θα μας βρει, φαντάζομαι. Βλέπω ότι είναι ακόμα μέσα, πάντως.
Ναι, ναι.
Terribly sorry. I knew that was going to happen. Sorry. So this administration was more optimistic or more hopeful that the nuclear deal will be revived. But I think the next administration, while it does not plan to leave the nuclear deal, and actually Mr. Raisi said that if he becomes president, he will not leave the nuclear deal, but I don't think that this administration is optimistic about the nuclear deal, so they plan to move on. And just, if the Americans go back to the deal, so much, that's fine. But if not, they're going to pursue a better relationship with China, with Russia, with the global south, and also to push towards local production and greater, let's say, to tap the potential that exists inside Iran. So I don't know if I gave a good explanation or not, or if I made it just more confusing. Iranian politics confuses me. So by my words, it's because I'm confused myself.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, on the same time, we have the negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right?
That's right.
What's your comment on these developments?
Well,
Is it promising?
The Iran-Saudi talks are not linked to the elections, and they're not linked to the nuclear, the talks over the nuclear deal, the implementation of the nuclear deal. Iran has been telling Saudi Arabia that we are willing to talk for many years now. But
That's true.
Have been insistent that they will not talk to Iran. So recently, in recent months, the Saudis have had a change of heart. In fact, they've had it quite a while. You probably have heard that General Soleimani, when he was murdered by the Americans, he was actually going to Iraq on a peace mission. He was about to see the Iraqi prime minister, who had received a letter from the Saudis. And then the Americans sort of, they murdered him when he had entered Iraq before he could meet the Iraqi prime minister. And many believe that it was partially to prevent any rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So after his murder, there was a period of quiet, but then the Saudis began to send messages again. And ultimately, the Iranians agreed to talk with them. I mean, the Iranians from long ago were more than willing. So when the Saudis were willing, the Iranians responded. They've had negotiations, and the Saudis have shifted considerably. And the Saudis are willing to move a lot. But there have been talks, but so far there haven't been results. But it does seem that there's been a major shift in mood in Saudi Arabia. The belief is that the situation in Saudi Arabia is not good. The war in Yemen, of course, has gone very badly, and parts of Saudi Arabia are now under the control of the Yemeni Ansarullah, the effective government in Sana'a in Yemen. And this is not really this is dangerous for the future stability of Saudi Arabia. So, but I have to make this footnote, or put this footnote here, or open a parenthesis here and say that Iran will not negotiate on behalf of Yemen. Iran has said very clearly to the Saudis that we will not negotiate on behalf of our allies, whether in Yemen or Iraq or in Syria or in Lebanon. But Iran, if the Saudis are willing to make positive steps towards improved relations, the Iranians are more than willing to take steps in that regard.
Now that you say that, I remember Mahmoud Ahmadinejad last summer, it was, that he has offered himself as a mediator between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Right?
Well, Mr. Ahmadinejad, he is seen often as...
And he gave an interview last night in Al Arabiya.
Yeah, Mr. Ahmadinejad is, how should I put it? He is seen more as someone who wants to gain attention. And he's not taken seriously in Iran. And the Yemenis don't even know him. He's not, the Yemenis have their own channels to speak with the Saudis. And he's not really in any position to mediate. But these are sort of publicity stunts that Mr. Ahmadinejad is pursuing.
Is it a simple coincidence, the fact that he gave the interview last night in Al Arabiya? I think it's more than his personal agenda here. That's my humble opinion.
It is his personal agenda. He has no authority in Iran to mediate, and Ansarullah does not consider him as a figure who could mediate. So he will continue to be giving. He sends letters to the presidents of the world, and he does these things often, giving interviews, and he likes to say sometimes outrageous things, so just to keep his name in the media. But at the moment, he doesn't have the sort of influence at all that he did a decade ago.
Espina, we have that kind of politicians here too. I think we call them attention whores. Sorry, Professor. But
yeah, he is of that. He's amusing to watch. Actually, It's very amusing to watch. People
But
stand just clicked around.
I was just impressed by the Al Arabiya's decision to take an interview. It's not who talks, but sometimes it depends on to whom you talk to. Huh? Sometimes.
Al Arabiya has a Saudi agenda, and the Saudis.
But it is a Saudi media, right?
Yeah. But the reason why Al Arabiya interviews him is not because of Yemen. They want to sort of use him to find a way to interfere in Iranian politics. So the Saudis have a different agenda.
Okay.
And Ahmadinejad plays into their agenda because he benefits from it, they benefit from it, but it doesn't have any real impact.
Can I take the lead this now?
Of course.
Okay, I would like to ask about women candidates. I think that this is an open conversation in the society of Iran for a few years now. There are women who are in the government. There are women who are, the vice president of the government, if I'm not mistaken, is an exceptional woman and very well known internationally woman. But thing is, when they're asked, they say, the council, that we're not stopping them from being candidates because they're women, but because they're not, according to what's going on. Where are we in that subject?
The Guardian Council has a criteria which is based on the Constitution and the law. And this is an open debate, and it's not about women per se, although some would say that the Guardian Council so far has not approved of any women to stand as president. But the Guardian Council, with regards to the candidates in general, say that the candidates have to meet a certain criteria. In other words, for example, they have to have served a number of years as a minister or as a
Κι άλλο τηλέφωνο, περιμένουμε λίγο. Το όνειρό μου είναι να πάρω συνέντευξη από την αντιπρόεδρο του Ιράν, να σας το πω και αυτό, να ξέρετε. Είναι, here he is.
That is my life. So the Guardian Council has a criteria about who can stand. So we've had actually the deputy speaker of parliament who's been refused. There are also other issues, so financial issues, the private sector, what their finances and all that. And there's always been controversy about why has this candidate been rejected. For example, in this election, the former Speaker of Parliament, who was the Speaker of Parliament for 12 years, and who before that was the head of the National Radio and TV and all that, they were his candidacy was rejected, and this was very controversial. And as I said, a lot can be said about Iranian democracy, and so on, but that is the system that exists. And when you look at Iran, which is a country under duress, which is a country under foreign pressure, and which is a country that has foreign manipulation, sanctions, and so on, I don't think you can expect, for example, Cuba, which is sanctioned by the United States, and for Cuba just to have open elections, because the Americans will manipulate it. They'll do exactly what they did in Nicaragua. They will, beat down the Sandinistas until people just raise their hands and let the Americans take over. So we have to take that into consideration. But there's never been any statement saying that women cannot be president. But so far, we have not had a woman whose candidacy for the presidency whose candidacy for presidency to be approved. But we've had women ministers in the cabinet. We've had vice presidents. one of the, perhaps the most important female politician in Iran was the former Minister of Health, because the Ministry of Health in Iran is huge, and all of the medical universities and the national healthcare system, all that, and is under the Ministry of Health. So she was basically running, I don't know, maybe 2 million government bureaucrats, or so her ministry was huge. So we've had, you know, my colleagues are women. The head of my faculty for years was a woman. The head of my department for years was a woman. Again, sorry. So that does not mean that the situation for women in Iran is ideal, and so on. But what I am saying is that the situation for women is not what you hear in the Western media. We have women pilots, we have women taxi drivers, we have women academics, but yes, if you were to ask me, is the situation ideal for women in Iran? No, it isn't. But it is not ideal, you know, the current economic. So for example, we have a lot of unemployment in Iran for women, but a lot of that is because of the sanctions. Because under, you know, these very severe sanctions, many people have lost their jobs. And that, of course, is the intention. The intention of the US sanctions, the EU sanctions, are to destroy the Iranian economy, to starve the population. As I saw in Syria, when I frequently travel to Syria, but the objective in Syria is to destroy people's lives, to have as many people die of disease and suffering as much as possible. So the situation in Iran is not under normal circumstances for it to be compared to other countries. But again, I would argue that despite all the difficulties, I think that Iran has achieved a lot. But if you were to say Iran could be a lot better than what it is, I would fully agree with that.
Greece good too, but the main reason I'm asking is because before coming to Iran, I've been 2 times there. What I was listening was that women are at home and stuff like that. And I saw a very strong female political. They were discussing everything. We would discuss politics. They were working. They're everywhere in the working force. So that's why it's like, why not there too, you know? Because women in Iran are existing. You see them everywhere. And that's a difference from a lot of other countries. And that's why my question is not, it's like, why? And they discussed that in front of us. They discussed the fact that there's not a woman president yet, or allowed to be, you know. So it's a debate, it's open, and it's important to know that it's open and that the women there are in.
Yeah, the debate is there, without a doubt.
I think that was.
Which is ironic,
right?
Because one of the ironies that we often see in the Western media is that Iran is a dictatorship, and that people are fearful of the government, and that the police will do whatever and kill people and whatever. But then they say there's going to be a low turnout in the presidential election. Well, if people can not vote, then that means they're not fearful of not voting. So if it was indeed a dictatorship, then people would go and vote if, you know, under all circumstances. Or if people cannot talk, then as you point out, when you get in a taxi in Iran, or when you speak to people in the streets of Iran or on campus, people say whatever they want. They attack the leader, they attack the president, they attack everything. You get in a taxi, and if it's particularly hot and it's noon, and you know, the taxi driver will give you a mouthful quite often about top to bottom. And this is not new. This has been the case, you know, since I was a teenager when the revolution happened. So a lot of what you hear in the Western media is nonsense. In Iran, you can say what you like. Again, I'm not saying that it's ideal. I'm not saying that Iran is some, you know, utopia. But again, it's like, I mean, Iran is far more developed than Cuba or Venezuela or any of the other countries that are being sanctioned by the United States. But when you look at each and every one of these countries, their circumstances are not, Venezuela's circumstances are not the same as Argentina's circumstances. Venezuela cannot be compared to Brazil or Bolivia, because those sanctions are meant for regime change. Of course, you could argue that in Brazil we had regime change, but a soft coup. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the United States is openly trying to overthrow the Cuban government. It's openly trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. It openly worked to overthrow the legitimately elected Bolivian government. And so countries that are under this sort of pressure from the United States and from its allies are going to deal with this reality. And therefore, if you say, well, why isn't everything completely open? Because the circumstances aren't ordinary. You have foreign manipulation, and some people may take advantage of that and go too far, or to narrow down people's choices. But again, what I'm saying is that you have to take into consideration that Iran is under extraordinary circumstances. And again, I would stress that in my personal opinion, Iran is an extremely open country when you take those circumstances into account. As I said, Trump was elected and there was an accusation that Russia was involved. You had 4 years of crisis in the United States. But when it comes to Iran, the United States is actively trying to undermine the country at all levels. And the United States is a much more powerful country than Iran. But despite that, we still see a significant degree of openness. Is it ideal? I stress again and again and again, no. But it is still substantial.
Ο επόμενος, Κωνσταντίνε Λάμπρο.
Good afternoon for me. I'm Lambros Zacharis from the Greek service of Sputnik News Agency. You said something about Western media. I would like to ask you that from what I've read, Western media have given reports that young people are not going to vote because they are angry with the political system in Iran. I would like to hear your opinion about this.
Well, the Western media will never say anything good about any election. So on the one, for example, the Western media sometimes will say that the president has no real power, right? So when on the one hand, they'll say what the president has no power. On the other hand, when Mr. Ahmadinejad was president, they were saying Ahmadinejad is going to destroy the world. Well, if the president has no power, then how come Ahmadinejad was supposedly going to destroy the world? Why was he a threat to the world? If he had no power, then he couldn't do anything. So that's one paradox. The second is, in the West, they often say, on some occasions, they say, no, the presidential in Iran, elections in Iran are all manipulated. But then they say that Rouhani was he was someone who was opposed to the establishment. Well, if he was opposed to the establishment, then how did he get elected in the first place? So if it is manipulation, then obviously Rouhani would not be able to become president. So the constant, the narrative, there's no consistency in the Western narrative on Iran. And those who say the youth do not vote, do they have polls? Are they carrying out polls? Because again, ever since the revolution itself, they've always been saying, for example, in the 1980s when I was young, the Western media, and I'm speaking about the corporate media, they would say that people hate the regime. And they use the term regime to sort of delegitimize Iran. And in the 90s, they said, well, the older generation liked the regime, but the younger generation want nothing of it. And then after the year 2000, they say, well, the older generation liked the regime, but the younger people hate the so-called regime. And now they're saying the same thing. So you see this constant narrative that is inconsistent. If younger people don't like that, they don't want to vote, they were saying the same thing about the older people when they were younger 20, 30 years ago. They were saying they don't want to vote, they don't want to have anything to do with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The turnout in this election is not going to be high. It will probably be in the 50s, perhaps in the mid 50s or something like that. I don't know, because polls are sort of indicating that now. However, part of it is due to the fact that Mr. Larijani, his candidacy was not approved. But I have to point out that the two moderate and reformist candidates were very hard hitting on television. In the debates, they were attacking Mr. Raisi very viciously. But more importantly, I think it is the issue of the coronavirus. Some people will not vote because of they are fearful of the coronavirus. Some people, there are no public, what do you call it? Public campaigning because of the coronavirus. So there's no real excitement. And the previous government, which was voted in by a strong majority of people, has done so poorly, as I said, partially because of Trump and because of the coronavirus, that there is voter apathy. But for them to conclude that the young people, they've been saying the young people since I was young. So, I don't take that narrative seriously. I mean, for 40 years, they've been saying the Islamic regime in Iran is unpopular and it's corrupt and people hate it and it's imploding and it's falling apart and it's incompetent. Yet at the same time, they're constantly saying that it's a growing threat, it's a danger to the world. Well, how can it be both things at the same time? If it's corrupt and falling apart, then why are you afraid of it? I mean, if it's falling apart, well, let it fall apart. It's like that on old car that you see in the cartoon where, the bits and, pieces are falling out, and ultimately it's just going to burn the motor is going to, burn itself out. But, they're all and contradictory narratives on Iran. And I think one reason why the United States and its allies can't come to terms with Iran is because they cannot accept the reality of Iran, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has legitimacy in the eyes of the public, that the Islamic Republic of Iran is dynamic, that the Islamic Republic of Iran is capable of self-governance, and it is capable of acquiring allies and friends across the region. And it's just not something that the United States and its allies want to accept. So they're always hoping that if they just push harder, if they make more people suffer, if they, crush the population.
Okay, thank you.
Κωνσταντίνε, είσαι έτοιμος εσύ?
Ναι,
Γιατί
μόλις
ξέρω ότι
επανέλθει.
όποιος άλλος θέλει να κάνει ερώτηση έχει ένα χεράκι, δεν έχει κάπως το
Yeah, sorry about that.
Να ρωτήσω κάτι ακόμα. Εγώ τι λες, Λαμπρινή, να κάνω μια ακόμα ερώτηση ή όχι?
Ναι, άμα
Sorry
θες,
about
ναι.
that.
Ναι,
Okay.
κάνε τον κύκλο. Πες.
Yeah, so they're saying that if they just, then people will revolt and, everyone will be carrying the American flag. And, I've often seen in the Western media, they say that the most popular, people in Iran, Iranians are the most pro-American people in the region. That sort of narrative and that sort of language is something that the Americans in the Western media wants to believe. But no sane people will love a nation that imposes sanctions on them. Yes, the liberals and the wealthy in Iran, the elites who travel to the West and back and who have, and who do business with and make a lot of money, usually they're pro-Western. But the bulk of the Iranian population is not happy with the United States. I have no doubt about that.
I would like to ask you also if what do you believe about the relations between US and Iran? Are they going to face new problems in the near future? You have said something in the previous answer, but I would like to become more specific. If they are going to have if they are going to face new problems, the relations between US and Iran?
I'm not very optimistic at the moment, but Biden, when he said that he wants to revive the nuclear deal, there are a number of problems here. First of all, when Obama was the president, he never fully implemented the nuclear deal. Iran did, and the United States didn't. And the Iranian government was, suffered a lot under Obama because the Iranians quickly did all of that which they were supposed to do. And the Americans and Obama, they dragged their feet. And until the very last day of Obama's presidency, the United States never fully implemented the deal. Under Trump, of course, we know what happened. Biden, when he came, since becoming president, it's been, I think, almost 6 months now, Biden has continued with Trump's policy. It is maximum pressure. He is trying as much as possible to make people suffer. His objective is to kill people, to have people die for lack of medicine, for people to lose jobs. His objective is to make Iranians suffer as much as he can, in the hope that he can get concessions from Iran, just like Trump, because that's what Trump was doing. Trump was saying that I'm going to impose sanctions to get more from Iran. The Iranians under Trump and under Biden are saying, no, we have a nuclear deal. We believe, many in Iran believe, we already gave too much. But whether we gave too much or not, we have an agreement with the United States. If you fully implement the deal, we'll fully implement the deal. But if you don't implement the deal, we're not going to implement the deal. So far at the negotiating table, the United States has not agreed to implement the nuclear deal in full. They only want to remove some sanctions and then have Iran implement their side of the bargain. It's sort of like me selling you a house and then you not paying for the house. And then you say, okay, I'll pay 1/3 and then let's finish, and now sell your car. It's not going to happen. The Iranians are saying that no, we will not appease the United States, because if we agree to violate our agreement, that means that the Americans in future, they will be able to use the same technique to get more concessions 6 months from now, 1 year from now. 1 year from now, they'll impose new sanctions and say, okay, give us some more. So the Iranians are saying, no, we have a deal. You go back to that deal, we go back to the deal. But if you want to add certain sanctions and have us go back to the deal, it's not going to happen. So at the moment, the relationship with the United States is not good. And alongside that, we have to take into account that the United States is supporting the genocide in Yemen. Iran is supporting Yemen. The United States has been supporting a dirty war in Syria and has sanctioned the Syrian people. The Iranians are supporting Syria. The same is true in Gaza. The same is true in Iraq. So the United States and Iran are having multiple conflicts at multiple levels. So as we speak, I would say the relationship is very bad. But
the role of, I'm going to interrupt here. The role of Israel and the change of government there. What's the role of Israel in all of this?
Well, the Israelis are not in themselves really that important. Israel is not a powerful country. Saudi Arabia, Israel are small countries. They're weak countries. Israel's strength is because of the United States. It's not because of like 6.5 million Israelis. It's the Christian Zionists in the United States, the evangelicals, and so on and so forth, and even the Jewish Zionists. But the real powerhouse is the Christian Zionists and the evangelicals, which are very powerful in the United States. So Israel's backers are important, but Israel itself isn't very important for Iran's calculations. When Israel says it threatens Iran or that it will attack Iran, if the Israelis know and the Iranians know that if the Israelis attack Iran, then Iran will strike Israel much harder. And I think we saw in Gaza that the limitations of the Israeli capabilities. So the Israel is a problem in the sense that it is part of the political culture of the United States to promote apartheid in Palestine, to support ethnic cleansing, to support the colonization of Palestine. And that, of course, is in sharp contrast to Iran's policy towards Palestine. Iran's policy towards Israel, the Israeli regime, is identical to its policy towards apartheid South Africa. After the revolution in Iran, broke off, the government broke off ties with both South Africa and Israel. Iran supported the resistance in South Africa, and it supported the resistance in Palestine. In South Africa, which is a sister apartheid regime to Israel, and we know the links between the two countries and how they got their nuclear weapons from Israel. When apartheid South Africa collapsed under the burden of its own paradoxes and its own inconsistencies and pressure from the resistance, when you had the new South Africa, Iran immediately established ties. And one of the first countries that Nelson Mandela visited after freedom was Iran. In fact, I was a student at the University of Tehran. I attended the ceremony where he received his honorary doctoral degree from the University of Tehran. The same is true with Israel. Now, while the Israelis like to say that Iran wants to wipe out the Israelis and commit mass murder and all that nonsense, Iran's policy towards Palestine is identical to its policy towards apartheid South Africa, and Israel and apartheid South Africa. If apartheid were to end in Israel, if ethnic cleansing were to end, if Palestinians, whether in within the 1967 borders or but also the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and those who are refugees who are living abroad, if they're given equal rights, if they're allowed to be equal citizens, if their rights are restored, then the problem with Israel is solved, just like South Africa. Of course, many South Africans actually get angry with me when I say this, because many of them say that Nelson Mandela actually did more good to the oppressors than they did to the oppressed, but I don't want to go there. After apartheid fell, many South Africans were upset that they remained poor and that the elites remained wealthy, and I'm sure you all know that issue. That's a different issue. That's economics. That's I don't want to go there. But in any case, whatever pluses and minuses of the ANC after it came to power, Iran accepted South Africa and restored relations with South Africa under the ANC, under Nelson Mandela. And if, hypothetically, the Israeli regime was to set aside apartheid, Iran's policy would be the same. And the belief in Iran is that, paradoxically, because of its aggressiveness and because of the colonization of the West Bank, the Israeli regime has actually pushed itself towards a very dangerous situation, because the two-state solution is dead. Even though Iran does not accept the two-state solution. Iran says that, let's say, if the whole of the West Bank is given to the Palestinians, that is only 14–15% of Palestine. And that those Palestinians who are, for example, in Gaza, most of them come from Palestine. They're refugees in Gaza and outside of Palestine, and they must be able to return home. But in any case, the so-called two-state solution is dead, because the Israelis have colonized the West Bank so much that there's no way that there's going to be a Palestinian state there. So ironically, what the regime in Tel Aviv has done is that they've pushed the situation to a point where they either have to ethnically cleanse millions of Palestinians, or ultimately there will have to be a one-state solution at some point.
Konstantine μου.
My name is Konstantinos Venakis from Documentum India, and I would like to ask you the following question. Recently, we were informed from the press that the deal between the USA and Iran regarding the sanctions is being finalized. Could you please tell us how Iran was able to survive and ultimately overcome the US maximum pressure campaign? What was its strategy, and what were the ramifications for the Iranian economy and society?
Well, the Iranian economy has suffered under maximum pressure under Obama. The maximum pressure campaign was something that Obama began. And Trump's anger towards Obama was that why did he do a deal with Iran? Obama's response was not that I don't like sanctions. Obama was very cruel. He was very cruel. But Obama said that the sanctions regime cannot last forever. It will gradually collapse. So he said, I did a deal with Iran because I knew that these sanctions will not last forever. Iran will gradually find ways to circumvent the sanctions and to get by. So it wasn't so that this brutal sanctions regime, it was something that Obama started. And it was something that Obama, the nuclear deal, as I said, was not because Obama was humane, but it was because Obama believed that the sanctions will not last, that he cannot sustain them. Under Trump, we saw the same thing. Trump reinstated those severe sanctions, and he was even worse than Obama. But during the last months of his presidency, we did see the beginning of the sanctions regime crumbling. So Iran's trade with foreign partners increased, Iran's export of oil and petrochemicals and gasoline and so on. So part of it was the fact that though that Iran built an indigenous industry and strengthened what Iran calls the resistance economy. In other words, becoming more reliant on local production rather than on imports. And to a degree that did have an impact, but it doesn't mean that the problems were solved. On the other hand, Iran tried to strengthen its ties with non-Western countries, countries like Russia and China, especially since Russia and China have also been increasingly sanctioned by Western countries. That has pushed them also closer to Iran. So these countries are sort of being pushed by the Americans closer to each other because the Americans are antagonizing all of them at the same time. So I think it's a combination both of a resistance economy that relies more on, on internal capabilities, but also finding new allies and new friends or reinforcing friendships with countries outside of the Western world and the Western sphere, looking to the East and to the global South. But again, the economic situation is not easy. As we speak, the economic situation is difficult. But in my opinion, as the situation for the United States becomes more difficult, both because of the crises at home in the United States, but also because of the sheer cost of the US presence in our region. I think that this is not sustainable for the United States. The US presence in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and elsewhere is very costly. And while the Chinese economy is growing at a rapid pace, the Americans are spending so much money in our region, waging wars and having military bases. And if the Americans want to keep spending, then the best way is to keep this hostility towards Iran. But if the Americans want to cut their spendings, the smart thing to do is for them to change their attitude towards Iran. So while Iranians are facing difficulty, the Iranians are circumventing the sanctions to a degree. They're developing their nuclear program as leverage, and across the region, they're making life difficult for the Americans. So if the Americans want to play it smart, they would change their policy. But we haven't seen the Americans play smart for a very long time.
And I have a follow-up question. I would like to ask you, in the previous decade, we saw Greece and Iran have extended cooperation on the energy sector. Today, what is the state of the affairs between Greece and Iran? What are the areas of cooperation right now? Can they be upgraded or extended? What are the prospects of the affair between the states, especially after the elections, taking in mind that we may have the conservative politicians take over after the elections, get elected?
Well, I think the problem it largely lies in the fact Sorry about that.
Okay.
I think the problem lies with the fact that Greece is under the influence of the United States. And I think that many elements within Greece would like to increase cooperation with Iran, but the Americans, out of fear of the United States, Greek politicians, Greek financial institutions, Greek businesses, and Greek civilization, civil society refrains from increased cooperation with Iran. The problem doesn't lie in Tehran. The problem lies in the fact that the United States is putting pressure on your government. And
Υπάρχει
it's
άλλη
not
ερώτηση?
unique to your government, by the way. It's not just unique to Greece.
Άλλη ερώτηση υπάρχει? Νίκο μου.
Ναι, οκ. Εγώ θα ήθελα να μπορώ. Ωραία. Mr. Marandi, my name is Nikos Vasilopoulos, and I'm on behalf of Insider.gr. And I would like to ask you, what are the next, if there are, and which are the next steps of Iran in terms of the One Belt, One Road initiative, in the relations with China, and if there are going to be any more steps towards the One Belt, One Road initiative?
I think that if Mr. Raisi or Dr. Raisi is elected as the president, that will be seen by China as a boost for Iran-Chinese relations, as I said earlier on. Iran is negotiating with China, and the two countries are cooperating together with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. They have many common interests because both Iran and China want Central Asia to be safe and secure. We know that the United States and its allies have been supporting extremist groups across the region, and there's a deep concern that the groups that destroyed so much of Syria and Libya, that they may be used by the United States to destabilize Central Asia. So both Iran and China are cooperating, and Central Asian countries are cooperating to deal with extremism and Saudi Wahhabism in Central Asia, and also they are working together with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative, because we do know that a significant branch of the Belt and Road Initiative of China would be passing through Iran towards the East Mediterranean and towards the Arabian Peninsula. So there is a significant amount of cooperation, but of course the American sanctions have in the past years hampered that cooperation. But I think that as time goes by, the Iranians and the Chinese are finding mechanisms for the two sides to circumvent the American sanctions and to ignore the American sanctions. The more we move forward, and the more the United States uses the financial sector as a weapon, the more countries will be moving away from the U.S. Financial sector and finding ways to circumvent it. So one of the foolish things that the Americans are doing is that they're overusing their financial weapon, the weaponization of the financial system. While it hurts Iran, but what it does in the long run is that it creates an incentive for Iran, China, Russia, and others to find new means of financial cooperation that go outside the realm of U.S. banks and the U.S. hegemonic system in the banking and financial sector.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Υπάρχει άλλη ερώτηση? Όχι. Παναγιώτη μου, ναι.
This is not fair though. It's 10 against 1.
That's true. But you're one but a lion, as we say here, so.
I'm more like a mouse, but anyway.
Παναγιώτη, μου σ' ακούμε.
Hi, my name is Panagiotis Sotiris. I'm from GR, one of the biggest news internet media in Greece. And my question is, what is the current Iranian perspective on the situation in Syria? Since you mentioned that you just returned from Syria. And how will the coming elections in Iran, are they going to change the policy, or how do you think the perspective from here on in regards to the situation in Syria, the entire political situation, the post-war development, etc.?
I think that probably the new administration will be looking more towards greater economic cooperation with Syria and Iraq, and they'll be more focused on regional alliances and friendships, as I said earlier on. Iran, of course, believes that this whole dirty war in Syria was led by the United States. We know now what the Iranians were saying in 2011 and 12 were all correct. Back then, the Iranians were saying that NATO and Western countries are leading a dirty war in Syria and that they're funding extremist groups. The Western media said this is all conspiracy theory, this is nonsense, this is all just a revolution. But we now know, for example, from WikiLeaks, and of course Julian Assange is, in prison because of these leaks, and he is a political prisoner because of those leaks. But thanks to Julian Assange, we now know that Jake Sullivan, who is now Biden's national security advisor, on February the 12th, I think, in 2012, or February the 12th or February the 14th, I'm not sure right now, he sent an email to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, and he said that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. So this is literally a decade after 9/11, that the United States and Al-Qaeda are cooperating in Syria. This is an email that indicates that the cooperation did not begin in February 2012. It began before that for him to make such a statement. So, or for example, we have the Defense Intelligence Agency documents of 2012 that was partially released. The Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States has almost 20,000 people working in it. It's a part of the Pentagon. In that document, it said that regional allies of the United States were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. What was that entity? It was ISIS. ISIS was Al-Qaeda, a part of Al-Qaeda, and it broke away from Al-Qaeda. So, and later on, the head of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, at that time, General Michael Flynn, in an interview on Al Jazeera, I think with Mehdi Hassan, he admitted that the United States took a willful decision to support its allies in Syria to create that Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq, which of course became ISIS. We also know that Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, in a meeting, in a leaked leaked audio, when he was speaking to these Syrian opposition people linked to the United States, he said to them that we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on Assad. This is all there. It is all online. Or for example, even Biden himself at Harvard in 2014, in his speech at Harvard, he said that our allies in the region, and he named Turkey, he named the Emirates, he named Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure he named Qatar, but he named some of these countries. And he said that they were supporting all these groups, including ISIS, to overthrow Syria. So from the very beginning, the issue in Iran, and of course, tens of thousands of foreign fighters came into Syria and Iraq through Turkey and Jordan, mostly Turkey. And many of them came from European countries, Western European countries, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium. And their intelligence services knew this. There was a steady stream of people flowing into Turkey. All these Western European intelligence agencies knew exactly what was going on. They were facilitating this. They were helping the creation of ISIS. They were helping with the strengthening of Al-Qaeda in Syria, along with the Saudis and along with the Israelis, because the Israelis were also supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda on their border, you know, from the Golan Heights, which of course is occupied territory itself. So the Iranians, and remember, Hezbollah only entered Syria in 2013. I actually, the first time I visited Syria after the dirty war began was on the day that the operation by Hezbollah began in Syria. It was, I think, in April 2013. That was 2 years after. That is well over a year after Jake Sullivan's email. So after already tens of thousands of foreign fighters had come to Syria from abroad, and they were heavily funded, did Hezbollah and Iran enter Syria to prevent Damascus from falling to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So while the Americans like to say Assad is murdering his own people, the reality is that Obama and his allies were, and Mr. Erdogan, which I know none of you like, and the Turkish government and others, and the Israeli regime, Netanyahu, they were waging a dirty war on Syria. And of course, you know, another issue that I'd like to raise here is the alleged chemical attacks. I will give you one example, and the rest you can figure out yourself. The alleged chemical attack in Douma 2-3 years ago, right? And then afterwards, the Americans struck Syria with missiles, the British and the French. That was a false flag operation. How do we know this? This area A was controlled by Jaish al-Islam, an extremist group that was funded by Saudi Arabia. They said this chemical attack took place. When did it allegedly take place? When the government was about to capture that area. Why would every time that there's a so-called chemical attack, it's when the government is about to win a battle? Why would the Syrian government wage a chemical attack if they're winning when they know that the Americans are going to use it as an excuse to attack them? A. B. In Douma, the OPCW, which is the organization, which is the UN affiliated organization for chemical weapons, they sent a team to Douma. That team concluded that this was a false flag operation. But the OPCW, under pressure from the United States, they did not use the original report from the people who were on the ground. And then they produced a different report basically blaming Syria. But then we had the whistleblowers. We had people from within the OPCW who came forward and said, what I saw in Syria was not reflected in the report. And this became a big issue. And there's a very good reporter called Aaron Matei, who writes for a Gray Zone, Gray, Gray Zone, who has done a series of investigative articles on this case, basically showing that the whole affair was a false flag operation, and the OPCW was used as a tool by the United States for its own agenda. And let me give you another example. In 2014, of how international bodies were used against Syria. In 2014, there was a Press TV reporter. Press TV is an Iranian English channel, which has been sanctioned, by the way. You cannot easily get it because the Americans sanctioned all the Sorry. So, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You were talking about Press TV.
So the Press TV reporter, her name was Serena Sheem. Serena Sheem. She was Lebanese American. She was reporting from the Turkish border. In 2000, and you can find her reports online, perhaps YouTube, although YouTube, you know how YouTube works. But in any case, they delete all the good stuff. But in any case, she was on the border and she said that I saw that World Food Organization trucks were being used to send in troops for ISIS and equipment for ISIS inside Syria from Turkey. The World Food Organization, which belongs to the UN, their trucks were being used to send in weapons and troops for ISIS. Then she gave another report very soon afterwards, and she said Turkish intelligence has accused me of being spying. She said this on Iranian TV. And she said, I'm very afraid. I'm not spying. I'm a journalist. She died hours later in an accident. She was an American citizen. None of the American journalists in Istanbul or in Turkey, or none of the journalists said anything about this. None of them pursued the case. Literally hours after she was threatened by Turkish intelligence, she died in a very mysterious car accident. It's a long story, you can find it. The truck driver, went missing. None of the American journalists, all the American journalists in Turkey, mainstream, they knew exactly what was happening. They knew that there was an extensive oil trade going on between ISIS and Turkey and the Kurdish areas in northern Iraq. They knew all this because they are a part of the dirty war. The Western media is a part of the dirty war. They are a part of the armed forces. They are cooperating with the US government and NATO in helping ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. And as you all know, in Idlib right now, it is where ISIS is, it is where Al-Qaeda rules. As we speak, NATO, regional countries, through Turkey, are helping Al-Qaeda in Idlib, and they do not want the Syrian government to regain Idlib from Al-Qaeda. So the evidence, I could go on until tomorrow and talk about Syria, but the point is that Iran's policy in Syria has to prevent Syria from falling into the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the great hero was General Soleimani. And that is why he was killed, because he saved Syria and Iraq from the black flags. And the Americans wanted him dead.
Νομίζω ότι έγινε ο κύκλος όλων. We all asked our questions. We said 1 hour, it's 1:15, so we're like...
So you owe me.
Yeah, we owe you. And hopefully we will be able to bring you in Greece soon.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you all in Tehran.
Okay.
As well.
Thank you so much.
It will be great.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. We hope everything will go okay. Thank you again. It was very important.
Thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a very good evening.
You too.
I'm sorry if I haven't been able to express myself well, but I tried.
Oh, you were wonderful. Thank you.
You're very kind.
Καλή νυχτή για τους πάντες.
You're very kind. Bye for now.
Bye for now.